Hi Group 1, I am providing you your feedback video on the grant proposal presentation draft. So I've got your draft pulled up in front of me. I also have your CFP that your group chose, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go through it and give you my suggestions. I've already parsed through your presentation draft, so I already have some initial notes for you, but as I go I'll also kind of you'll get kind of like my, oh yeah, and what about this and what about that, so kind of, you know, off the cuff feedback, which I tend to try to keep from doing too much, but because I know that too much feedback can be overwhelming. So I think you guys chose a great CFP. It is for a very good cause, and it is a government organization, the Housing and Urban Development, the HUD program, which is offering this. So this is essentially, the government has said, we want to, if we look at your CFP, right, where the government has set aside or given this $10,270,000 to HUD and said, okay, with this money, HUD, we need you to solicit proposals, these grant proposals, and specific to a particular topic, and that particular topic is housing for veterans. And I think the most important part of this CFP is this bit right here that says this project, the VHRMP, the Veteran Housing Rehab and Modification Pilot Program, is going to award competitive grants to nonprofit organizations, right? So right away, you know your client needs to be a nonprofit org. And this nonprofit org needs to provide nationwide or statewide programs that primarily serve veterans or low-income individuals. So they can serve just veterans, or low-income individuals. I mean, it's going to be veterans. You know, veterans or low-income veterans who need financial assistance, or could, you know, a lot of times these programs have multiple programs for veterans. And then that next sentence, the grants may be used to modify or rehabilitate eligible veterans' primary residences. So this is how the grant money, if you are somebody who received grant funding from HUD, this is how the money should be spent. Modifying or rehabilitating eligible veterans' primary residences, or to provide grantees affiliates, because a lot of times the nonprofits will be affiliated with other organizations that help them to do the thing that the nonprofit wants to do. For example, with building houses or modifying houses or creating these adaptive housing sites, you know, the nonprofit might not be able to do it themselves, so maybe they have an affiliate. An affiliate is a particular construction company that knows how to rehabilitate houses so that they are adaptive and made accessible for disabled individuals. That would be an example of an affiliate. So these affiliate with technical, administrative, and training support. So you have, you know, the technical aspect of it and the administrative part of it, right? What are the logistics? How do we do this? How do we pay people? Right, that's all the behind the scenes work of what happens. And then the training, obviously. So that's the most important thing. And then in terms of the amounts of the grants, right, so the HUD has been given by the government a total of this upwards of $10 million. But every applicant is able to receive up to $1 million. So you can request up to $1 million, and then you need to spell out what that, you know, why you're asking for that amount. Maybe you only need $500,000. It just depends, again, on your client and what the particular project that you're proposing for this particular client. So I think those kind of basic things are missing from your grant proposal. If we so you have, I like your title page, proposal for financial assistance for disabled low-income veterans. Now, here this is the thing, your proposal focuses on financial assistance, whereas the grant is focused on housing rehabilitation. So this is where there's a little bit of a disconnect between what you're recommending in your proposal, or what exactly it is you're proposing. You're proposing this financial assistance versus housing rehabilitation, or rehabilitating houses to be adaptive housing. So you're missing that housing aspect. And if it is financial assistance, it might be financial assistance used specifically for the purposes of housing rehabilitation, but that seems like too many degrees of separation between the aim of this grant proposal presentation and the actual CFP itself. So you're probably going to want to revise that a little bit. It's not to say that financial assistance can't be a part of your grant proposal project. It just means that the main focus, according to the CFP, is housing rehabilitation. And you've kind of steered away from that a little bit and focusing on the financial assistance, and that's reiterated here, right, when you say our company is financial aid for disabled veterans. So, and here you go from financial assistance to financial aid. Those can be read as two different things because, again, what is this financial aid or financial assistance for? So that's still a little bit vague, and sorry, I was just reading the rehabilitation part here. Sometimes these feedback videos are my stream of conscious thoughts. But going to your second slide, your table of contents, the first thing I saw was the problem with disabled low-income veterans, and I initially chuckled at that because I was like, okay, so you're saying there's a problem with these people. So you might just want to, and that's just, I know you don't mean that, but you want to revise that rhetoric so that you're not positioning it as disabled low-income veterans are problematic. This is a problematic population. I think, I think I know what you're saying, which is that this is a specific population that needs attention, or, something along those lines. So I would probably, and I know I gave the sample, I'm trying to remember, I think the grant proposal sample I gave had a table of contents. I don't know if a table of contents is best for your particular presentation draft. I'm thinking more of objectives, of what each part, a table of contents could work. I think it's just that the way it's set right now is not, I don't know, as a reader or viewer of this presentation, I wouldn't understand what's happening. Like, I understand, like, okay, introduction, the second one obviously needs help. Solutions to the problems, that's vague. Schedule of events and budget, okay, I get it. I would split those up because you first want, budgetary needs, available resources versus needed resources, right? Those are two different things. And then after that, I would offer a timeline of how that money is to be spent and what are the deliverables after, across the timeline. The CFP does not give a timeline that I saw. So, it's just not a renewable grant. So, because sometimes in grants, what you'll see is like, grants will be competitively awarded up to $1 million each to selected applicants, which can be potentially renewed for another 3 years, right, or something like that. You don't have that, so you have one shot at this. There's no renewing this grant proposal. So your timeline might be 3 years, it might be 5 years, it might be a year, it just depends. Again, the CFP is not specific about it. They're very specific about the fact that this is a pilot program, and I understand why it's a pilot program after I did some research on adaptive housing and veterans. It is a very underserviced, very unfortunately underserviced resource. So, and I'm trying to see where I said it, and that's why they say here, right, I think is in this part, right, that the purpose of HUD having this pilot program is to explore the potential benefits of awarding grants to nonprofit orgs to rehabilitate and modify the primary residence of veterans, right? So these are people who are already living in a place, but they need their home rehabilitated, which means it needs to be made into an adaptive housing. I understand specifically what this means because my mom is in a wheelchair, and their house where my parents live has had to undergo rehabilitation to make it an adaptive housing so that she can get around, that she has all the safety equipment she needs, and they actually have people who come in and inspect it because it's liability issues. So they do have people come in and inspect everything, and you can have professionals come in, right? Those would be affiliates. But so this is very specific to housing. So you really only want to focus on housing for this. But going back to your presentation draft, I'm going to look at the introduction. My initial reaction to the introduction is that it's short. The intro when I first read through it, I said, it sounds like you're putting forth a grant, because you said, we have up to $13.7 million in funds to award competitive grants to statewide. So, and that might be a quote from, I'm trying to think where I saw $13.7 million. I don't know if I saw it in here or not, but it's either you're quoting from this particular CFP or you're kind of making your own. This isn't how you want to approach an introduction. Your introduction, just like any introduction, should first get to the issue, right? So the introduction should start with something along the lines of, disabled veterans or adaptive housing for disabled veterans is an under researched and often forgotten resource for this particular population, and then you want to give some evidence to further support and corroborate or substantiate that idea that, like, there are a lot of disabled veterans that they might live in homes, even if they're low income, but whether they're low income or not, but to rehabilitate a house is not cheap. Like, to do anything to a house is not cheap. Like, to replace an air conditioner, to get new roofing, let alone, like, if you need to put a ramp in, or you need to put in a new shower that can fit a wheelchair, or if you need to widen doorways or knock down walls, right? This is not cheap stuff to do, because you're any type of rehabilitating to a structure is expensive. Sometimes they call it gutting. But you can rehabilitate, and I don't know if you guys are also looking at rehabilitating as psychiatrically, but that's not what this grant is looking at. They're looking at the rehabilitation of the houses, so rehabbing the houses versus, for example, if you were looking at a mental health CFP. We need more mental health resources for disabled veterans, or just veterans in general. But you can rehabilitate housing, which means you try to make it better through doing something to it. So you want your introduction to focus on that, right? Focusing on, this is the issue, right? There's these disabled veterans that, whether low income or not, are lacking the financial assistance to be able to rehabilitate their housing, providing evidence of that, and then going into, this nonprofit, and maybe I'll go into the client conversation right now, but then you need to show after you demonstrate the issue itself, then you go into, our nonprofit or this nonprofit, again, depending on if you're positioning yourselves as the grant writers or you're positioning yourselves as people who already work for this nonprofit, right? So this, I'm just going to pretend for $1 million, I'm going to pretend that you already work there. Our nonprofit X, right, does this. It has done this for numerous years. We would, with this X amount of numbers from this grant opportunity, we would be able to do these things, right? So that would be, and then you'd want to kind of spell out almost like a thesis statement then what the proposal is, right? With this $1 million, what are you going to do? Are you going to rehab houses? If so, how are you going to do that? How are you going to find people? How are you going to, who are your affiliates? Those types of things. So, in terms of a client, I haven't yet seen one. So I'm just going to give some examples of a client. And this is where I started finding that there are a lot of grants for adaptive housing, but there's not a lot of nonprofit orgs, at least that I can find, that are focused on adaptive housing for disabled veterans. And I found 3 that I thought were efficacious. So the first one is this Homes for Troops. Yes, it's a hideous website, but I found some that I was like, okay, because this goes into the credibility conversation. How credible is and you actually want to make sure they're a nonprofit. So the ones that I've chosen, I'm fairly certain are a nonprofit. But so this Homes for Troops one is focused on housing. So, right, and they say our mission, if I can do the whole thing, right, to build and donate specially adapted custom homes nationwide for severely injured. Now they're focused on post 9/11. That's not unusual. I've seen that quite a bit. Post 9/11 veterans to enable them to rebuild their lives. Some grammar problems in that, but I'm not going to talk about it. And this is something you can kind of read through, like they talk about our homes. You can, if you're a veteran and you need housing assistance, you can request assistance, help for veterans. This is something, this would be an example of a client who would be asking HUD for money to continue to do the work that they're doing. Same thing with the Wounded Hero program. I think that's what it's called, which is part of the Helping a Heroes, because their whole title is Helping a Hero. And then they have the Wounded Hero Home program. And this is a 501c3, so it's a nonprofit. And they are dedicated to building adapted homes for physically disabled individuals, right? And they're very specific about it. Missing limbs, paraplegics, quadriplegics, severe burn victims, suffer from TBI, etc. We have awarded 100 homes in 22 states, so they're nationwide, not statewide, which is fine because that's under the CFP. So this is another very specific client that could say, okay, again, this is, we could use this $1 million from HUD in order to, triple that number in less the time, or something along those lines. The other thing I found was the Gary Sinise Foundation, which at first I was like, okay, maybe it's because he played Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump, I think it is. But then when I read the about, it's that Gary Sinise had taken a strong interest in first responders after 9/11, and so he's created this foundation that is focused on the same thing that the other 2 are focused on, which is about the housing and creating these or building these or rehabilitating these homes basically to yield these adaptive housing or adaptive housing in general. So this is those are 3 potential clients that you would focus on, right? So I'm just going to use Helping a Hero as the example client to talk about the rest of your presentation. So then for your introduction, right, you would say, here's the disabled veterans, low income or not, have had difficulty in attaining financial assistance, required to rehabilitate their homes to become adaptive housing to fit the needs, or something along those lines. So that's that first part where you address the actual issue, that there's these disabled veterans that are in financial need of having their homes rehabilitated to yield adaptive housing because they are disabled. So that's first identifying of, here's the situation, and then bringing in the client. What was it? Helping a Hero? Okay, I remembered. Right, then you would bring in, our nonprofit, Helping a Hero, has focused on, right, whatever they're focusing on. You would have to look more at their details than I have. Focused on rehabilitating homes for disabled veterans for this number of years. This is what we've done so far in this number of time, by securing, or the opportunity, with the grant opportunity of $1 million, that would allow our nonprofit to be able to do these things, and then being very specific about what those things are. That would be the proposal, what these things are, and then you would have to figure that out. But that would be your introduction. So, and here's a little bit of that wonky rhetoric with the problems. I understand what you mean, but it's like you're saying that low-income disabled veterans are a problem, which they are. There's a problem regarding low-income, how culture and the government are, and the VA or whoever, that this is an issue that needs addressed, but you're not saying that they're a problem and we need to get rid of them, right? That's not what you're saying. So it's just a rhetorical choice, so you'll just want to reword that. You might even just get rid of problems. You might just say low-income disabled veterans, or you can even just say disabled veterans, because the CFP says that it could be low-income or not, if I remember correctly. Sorry if I keep touching the mic. I have an itch right by where my mic is on my face. But it says, veterans or low income. So they don't have to be low income. They could just be disabled. So you could just say disabled veterans and housing, and give a brief history, recent history. I want to say, don't go back to World War I. But it might be what does the landscape look like right now for adaptive housing and disabled veterans? So you'd want to give more information on that, even though you would address that briefly in the introduction. Here's your chance to kind of really talk about what that looks like. And then also, I would bring in the client here again. This is the issue. Here is how we as a nonprofit organization have been attempting to mitigate or ameliorate this situation, this cultural concern. Going on to homelessness and unemployment, what was I going to say? Okay. Well, I was going to give a note, but I have changed here. My note, really for every slide, is that you need to have evidence integrated on every slide. So, for example, if you take my revision recommendation advice, where you talk about the current landscape, or maybe the landscape post 9/11, or post the Iraqi War, from the 90s, right? It depends on what landscape you want to look at. So what does that landscape look like for adaptive housing and disabled veterans? This is the first time I've ever heard about it. When I first saw the word adaptive housing, I was like, what is that? So this is something that is not, mental health and veterans has become part of the mainstream conversation that we have in our country. But this concept of adaptive housing is not. And I think that's partly why HUD has been given this large sum of money, this almost $11 million, to do this pilot program, because this is not a conversation that is talked about, at least in the mainstream culture. So providing some information on that shows that, the nonprofit has done its work in terms of information about this particular thing. That's the landscape. This is what the landscape looks like. There are this number of disabled veterans who are no longer active, and this number of them need adaptive housing. What does it cost to rehabilitate a home, depending on the size of the home? What does it mean to rehabilitate a house? Does it mean some of those things I said before, like adding ramps, adding showers, different showers, pulling down walls, and enlarging doorways? It could be, adding multiple ramps. It's just depending on the disability, there's going to be a myriad of different types of rehabilitation. So you might also give an example of what some of those look like. But circling back to my point, like, you need to have evidence for what that looks like. The homelessness and unemployment, you are giving some good statistics here. None of them have evidence attached to them, so you'll want to, like I said, anytime you have this type of information, and you want evidence on every slide. This information might come sooner, because what I'm thinking about is you might talk about first what the landscape, because here what you're doing is you're looking at the landscape of disabled veterans in general. So, and here's what you're saying. Now you're bringing in homelessness. That's possible. Now that's a slightly different thing, because the CFP is focused on rehabilitation, not necessarily building houses. So that's a slight tangent from because they're modifying the primary residence. So they're not really focused on homelessness or unemployment. So those are not focused on in the CFP. So if you bring in homelessness, one, you're going against the CFP's criteria, and that's a separate CFP, right? Is how do we get homes how do we help build homes for veterans, right? Then you would look at something like Habitat wow, that name just left my brain. Habitat for Humanity, is that what it's called? Okay, I think that's it, right? Those are the people who built the homes, the nonprofit. So I might do away with the homelessness and unemployment, only because it's not within the CFP's criteria, and really focus on disabled veterans. And you can even do away with the low income, because honestly, whether you're low income or median income, unless you're making like a lot of money, like I said before, rehabilitating any primary residence is really expensive. So it's financial assistance that everybody could use, not just veterans, but it's more because they're veterans, and we want to give back to them because they have served our country. And so it's about giving back. So rather than, the couple down the street who weren't veterans, it's not to say that they're worse because they didn't serve the country. It's just that, you're both maybe able to work steady jobs, versus if you're a disabled veteran, you might have a harder time finding work. You might also have mental health issues that you need to deal with. So therefore, work might not be a steady income, right? There's lots of things that we could talk about with that. So I would keep the data here. Remember, these are my recommendations. I'm not forcing you to do anything. These are all just my recommendations. I would recommend that you trash the homelessness and unemployment, as terrible as that sounds. But I'm trying to focus on what the CFP says and making sure that everything you have in your proposal, in order for it to hypothetically be a successful proposal, needs to focus on what the criteria of the CFP is. And that includes rehabilitating the primary residents, which means these are veterans who already live in a home, and making them and converting them into adaptive housing. So that would then lead you to question yourselves as a group, why do we have this information? I would want this information. You may just need to couch it in a slightly different way. So, and I also kind of want to know what this looks like, not just in percentages, but what that looks like in numbers. Like, is 50%, or I'm looking at this one, 29.6% of veterans aged 21 through 64 have a disability. Okay, so how are you defining disability? I've worked in disability studies, so I have a lot of responses I can talk about with disability. But in terms of what is disability, are you talking about quote unquote physical disability, that is visible disabilities, or because that's what Helping a Hero is focused on. They're focused on, the paraplegics and the quadriplegics and missing limbs and severe burn and TBI and things like that. So those are physical/visible disabilities. And then we have invisible disabilities, which are what we call the psychological or psychiatric disabilities. So, which presumably don't need adaptive housing, right? If their quote-unquote body is intact, or they're not missing limbs or something to that degree, then they're not as in need of, or any need at all of adaptive housing as the disabled veterans who have physical or visible disabilities. So you need to define disability, and then that begs a question of this percentage, which is, this percentage, is it physical or is it visible or invisible? And then what does that look like numbers-wise? So we do need to know the difference. Otherwise, that statistic has no real in-depth meaning. And then this one, of the disabled veterans identified to have a disability, again, what disability? By the Census Bureau, only 37% are employed. These disabilities may or may not be service-related. So again, 37% employed, again, are those visible, invisible? What type of employment do they have? Are any of them on unemployment or receiving VA support and are not employed? Are they receiving disability? So, and then you have the ACS, which I think is the same, because I'm seeing American Community Survey, but you didn't give an acronym, but then you give an acronym here, so it's just a little bit confusing. Of the disabled veterans identified by the ACS whose disabilities are service-connected, only 32% are employed. So I feel like these two could be combined, because here you say these disabilities may or not be service-related, and here you say, but here you give us that information. 32% of those whom are employed, their disabilities are service-connected or service-related. So I'm not sure why those are given in separate bullet points. VA benefits, again, I don't know how it's related. Again, it would tie to whomever your client is and who their affiliates are. So it's not to say that the VA doesn't have relevancy. It's just that if you're working with if the client is, Helping a Hero, you would want to know before you provide information on the VA, because what you're saying, I understand the issue here. This is because this is a potential obstacle for how disabled veterans can secure financial assistance for getting adaptive housing. But overall, and in terms of how that has to do with the client and the CFP, it's a little bit lost on your viewer. And then you get into adaptive housing. So this is something that probably needs to be earlier in the presentation. I would even gamble to say after your introduction, because as I talked about here, which is what you currently have after your introduction, this is where you would want to talk about the concept of, or the, a brief, more information about the client, more information about the issue, and more information about what the client has done for the issue. And so that issue would be adaptive housing. And then you might want to give I would give some percentages, but then I would question how you're presenting this information and what information you're presenting. And after that, I would go directly into budget. So I would go into available resources. So what resources do you currently have that you don't need money for? So if my client were helping a hero, I would say, okay, well, what resources do they already have? And you would want to list those. And then I would have another slide that would talk about resources needed, and then you want to budget those out. How are you spending that $1 million? And that would include, if you identify as people already working there, giving yourselves those quote-unquote playing pretend credentials, like I'm the director of the helping a hero, I oversee all of the infrastructure and blah blah blah, right? And maybe you want money, and so you then would say, this is how much money I want to do this. Like if your goal is to, I would need to look more closely at their, like what they've done, which I'm trying to figure out would be, they even have financials, which is good. Program accomplishments, let's see. I don't want to spend a time just quietly looking at something while I'm talking to you, talking to a computer. But what I would look at more closely, for example, if they were your client, is because you'd want a goal, right? So if they've offered X number of adaptive housing for X number of people in X number of states, maybe you're like, if I were in charge or working for helping a hero, I would say, great, I want to double that number. I want to do more, and I want to do more in more states. Or maybe there's specific states that have more veterans. I don't know. But you would want to give specifics about that. Like, it's not just, we want to keep doing what we're doing. It's like, we want to do more. And this $1 million can help us double how many adaptive housings, how many houses, primary residences we can rehabilitate with this $1 million, and here's how we're going to spend that $1 million in order to double what we've already been able to do, and therefore be a much more effective nonprofit. So that's information that you really need. And then you want a timeline. So from when you would be awarded that $1 million, how would it be spent, right? And then what do you need the money for? Do you need to spend the money on personnel? Do you need to spend the money on, the tools that would actually, and equipment that would be needed to rehabilitate a house? So then you might need to look into numbers of what it costs to actually rehabilitate a primary residence into or an adaptive housing, or an adaptive house. So you might need to look into numbers of that if you haven't already, but you need costs for that. Like if it costs $500,000, and I have no idea what I'm talking about. If it costs $500,000 to rehabilitate one home, how many homes could you really realistically do, right? So you would need costs. Like when I first read that they had done like 100 houses in 22 states, I was like, that's not very many. But now that I'm thinking about like what it would actually take and what it would actually cost, like that's a lot. So again, you'd want to look at those numbers, and maybe, depending on how expensive certain things are, maybe you want to focus on, one particular type of rehabilitation. If people are really in need of ramps, right, or showers, then maybe that's just what we want to focus on. Again, depending on the cost of it. But then you want that time, like, right, from the year or whenever you receive the grant, what do you expect? And so you have like when you receive the money and then your goal. So maybe it's 5 years or 10 years, whatever it is that you would decide as a group, right? Okay, by 3 years we expect this to be done. In order, if we want to go from 100 houses to 200 houses, how do we make that possible with $1 million? So, and then that's how you would then want to figure that out. I unfortunately don't have the answers for you because I don't know. And then yeah, like you have scheduled spreadsheet. I'm guessing this is, I'm not sure if it's linked to something else, but here you start kind of talking about, we will start hiring personnel come the mid to end of May. Again, what personnel? And then you haven't given me, if I'm reading this as HUD, you haven't given me any idea of your current available resources as the client, like what the client already has, and who their affiliates are, that is, who their connections are. And then I like your idea of recruiting volunteers, but what does that look like? How many hours would they work a week? What would their credentials be? So this all needs to be fleshed out in terms of the presentation. So I don't want to go on too long, but that's my initial thoughts. I could talk about everything for longer, so I oftentimes have to cut myself short. But if you have any questions after watching this video, or want more clarification on something, or you're working on it and you're like, oh, we're not quite sure if this is the right way we're doing something, like, don't hesitate to reach out. Like, I'll still be popping into the different groups as team meeting discussion areas and looking at how conversations are going. But also don't hesitate to reach out to me through Canvas or email. That's the other thing. Otherwise, good start. A lot of changes need to be made, a lot of revision. It's not to say that you can't repurpose some of the stuff that's here, but again, you always want to be focusing on how are we fulfilling what we need to fulfill for the CFP, and you definitely need that client specificity, which you don't have right now. At least the one you have, it's focused on the financial aspect of it, but then there's also no information about what this client is, or who they are, or what resources they have, or anything like that. So that's all I got for now. I mean, I got more, but I have to stop, or otherwise I'll go on for another hour. But like I said, feel free to contact me, and I will talk to you guys later. Okay, bye.